giant elections nerd. But petition validation this cycle was unbelievable. For my half of the county, we had something like 19 candidates that I was responsible for getting on the ballot, which involves getting canvassers out there to collect signatures and validating them. And there were some that were right up to the line of like, are we going to get these on or not? And get people out there to, you've got to get this done. It's the last minute. Go out and do it. And it happened and got everybody on the ballot and nobody disqualified. It's kind of nice.
We can get involved at every level of campaigns, from fundraising to helping candidates get elected. But what I probably enjoy the most is the public policy part of preparing a candidate for election. I enjoy putting together white papers and position papers.
Like John, we do work that sort of spans, candidate work, election stuff. I probably have two favorite things that I did this year. I represent Congresswoman Sinema, so it was very exciting to have her reelected, and so that work this election cycle was very rewarding and fun. Also, I do a fair amount of litigation relating to initiatives and referenda, and I usually have clients that are proponents or opponents of the initiative or referendum. But this year, I was actually hired by the city of Glendale to work on the opposition to a referendum to build a casino in the city of Glendale, and so that litigation is still pending, but it's very interesting because it raises questions about initiative or petition signatures and being able to refer legislative acts versus administrative acts, and so very interesting.
So I represent the client on the other side.
Oh, okay.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Start with you.
Well, I think that, I don't know how many, if you guys have looked at as part of your class, the Title 16, which are the statutes that govern elections in Arizona, but they're a gigantic mess. And part of the problem is that over the years, the legislature has passed various pieces of these statutes, but nobody's really ever taken a look at the entire code, and I think that we're in desperate need of somebody, or the legislature really, to sort of revisit how the different statutes work with each other. I think in terms of voting, one of the things I would love to see in Arizona, which I think would really help voter turnout and actually getting folks to be more engaged in the electoral process, is same-day voter registration. Several different states around the country do this, and I think that it would be great if people didn't have this sort of barrier to the 29-day before an election to have to get registered. If you could go to the polls and register to vote right then and there, that would be great. Also, one other thing that I think would be great for the electorate is if we didn't have specific precincts and polling places. Every year, the precincts change, the polling places change, people move, they don't know where to go, they go to the wrong place, and I think it causes a lot of folks who would otherwise be interested in voting not to vote. And so if we had, and I know I think Yuma does this now, where they just have voting centers, and they have electronic machines at these various community centers, and you just go in and you type in your zip code, and as long as you can verify your address, you can vote, at any one of these voting centers, as opposed to having to go to a specific precinct or polling place. Those are my two thoughts that I have.
Just on that question, the main reform that I'd like to see is to have a shorter period of time in which voting occurs. And you might think that it's a benefit to all of us to have a longer period of time. It's roughly 30 days right now that you can vote by mail or vote at a polling place, and then also on election day. But the problem with that setup is that the candidate who's behind can never catch up. And it really disadvantages a candidate that might be behind 3 or 4 points. And in that first couple of weeks, the candidate that's ahead is banking votes. Those votes are already cast, and they're already in the bank. And something can change in an election that causes the electorate to like the challenger or the person who's the underdog at the end, and that underdog never has a chance because of all the votes that were banked at the beginning of the cycle. So it worked to my advantage with most of my candidates because they were leading going into that cycle. But I will tell you that if you had a shorter cycle, I think, so shorter cycle like a week and a half that you could vote, it would benefit all of us because we would have nearly all of the information that a campaign has to give out by that time when we make our decisions.
You know, I'm not sure how much I would agree with that. I mean, I'm with the Maricopa County Democrats. I've worked with a lot of underdogs in the state. And our experience has been that, like, those underdogs need lower advocacy voters to turn out. You need more time to get to those voters, to get information from them, to get them to turn out to vote. And the chief complaint that I get from voters on doors and calls isn't that they have too long or that they, are worried about some last minute thing. It's that 9 times out of 10 in Arizona, we're presenting them with this gigantic ballot. I mean, this year was kind of odd that we didn't have a litany of citizens' initiatives on the ballot, but they complained, I don't know who the candidates are, I don't know these initiatives, I don't know my school board, I don't know any of this stuff. So I would be loath to advocate to extend it any further. I think any longer than what we do now would be ridiculous. But to shorten that time, I'm hesitant to think that anybody is served by having less opportunity and less time to go and vote.
Well, the responsibility of voting is really upon the citizen to vote, and we all have this great gift. I just came back from China, where it's not a democratic system at all. It's a one-party system. People would, I think, really love the American system if they were able to participate in it. I came back from China and I saw all those ads where the candidates were attacking each other, and sometimes in deceitful ways. It made me feel a sense of at least we live in a system where people can freely speak, even if they speak inappropriately. But I really, the challenge with voter turnout is that in this information age, there should be no excuse for not knowing who the candidates are. In this information age where you can Google anything, you ought to be able to Google something about everybody that's running and make a decision and show up at the polls and vote. So barring the initiative on the part of the individual to take advantage of the freedom and the most important task that they have, which is the participation in democracy, then it really falls on the candidates to go out there and identify their voters and get them to the polls.
So do you have any suggestions for how they would identify those voters and get them to the polls?
How we do it is probably the same way that, that my colleagues do it over here. We take voters that we think are likely to go to the polls, right? We look at voters that, if given the right information, the right motivation, given a ride to the polls, given an opportunity to be presented with getting on the early voting list and participating that way. What we do is we look at the demographics of who would likely vote for our candidate, whether they are a current high efficacy, meaning they vote a lot voter, or they're not. And we call them up on the phone. We get to know them and build a relationship with them the best we can, and we try to get them to vote that way. I think the Democratic Party did a really good job at the Navajo Nation, trying to identify voters that there aren't high efficacy voters in Kirkpatrick's district, and were able to get enough of them to show up that it caused probably the margin of success that she needed in order to beat Andy Tilden. The Republicans, I think, made some inroads with Hispanic voters that is surprising. And so that intentionality about reaching out to Hispanic voters seems to have worked in attracting a few new voters to the polls who actually voted not the traditional Democratic way, but the Republican.
Paul, you have not spoken yet, which is very unusual.
I'm
so-
saving my fire for questions 4 and 5.
Okay, because I have something to say here, but why don't you go first?
I'll be curmudgeonly here and say that this idea of we need to increase voter turnout may be wrong. I mean, it's a free country. If you don't want to vote, don't vote. You don't have an obligation to vote. It's not. I mean, we're not China. You don't have to vote if you don't want to. The idea that we need more people to turn out, I think, puts too much faith in democracy and maybe not enough faith in the republic, small r, part of our country, which is we're supposed to be a nation of laws, and democracy can only has so much room to maneuver before it bumps into the walls. And so, for me personally, I'm more interested in the laws part than democracy. But this isn't my area, so take that as you will for just me trying to, light a fire under something.
I think that's a really interesting thought, and a lot of people that I've talked to after the election sort of raised this issue, which is, a lot of developed countries around the world require voting as a part of being a citizen. If you're a citizen of a democratic country, you have an obligation to vote. And so it's an interesting question whether, how do you balance the sort of freedom in our country to do what you want versus, this responsibility and obligation that comes with being a citizen, and in terms of whether we should be requiring voting. I don't know what the answer is, and I'm not sure we're going to end up on either side of that anytime soon. But one of the things that I think is a real problem for voter turnout is that I think voters just are disengaged and they're annoyed by the election process. I've talked to so many people, and you read articles, I think, after the election about a bunch of people who said too many ads, too much mudslinging, too much stuff for too long. And after a while, I don't care anymore, and I'm actually, affirmatively annoyed with the information overload. And I go to try to figure out who's who and what they stand for, and I don't really know what's true because there's, I think this election cycle, the buzzword was dark money. There's money coming in from outside organizations and groups, and they're influencing how people think about candidates and issues. And I don't know what's real anymore because it's really the folks who can run ads and get out a message that are, that are dictating sort of the way people vote. So I don't know if maybe the answer is shortening the election cycle, if it's shortening the campaign period, if it's capping, outside money. All of this, though, goes to regulation, and then people who say, we should have less regulation, not more. So, but these are thoughts. One other thought on this, on voter turnout, I think, is the independents in Arizona. We have, this huge group of independents, and they don't vote. They don't have you have to go and request to vote in the primary if you're an independent. You have to ask for a Democratic or Republican ballot. So one of the pieces of legislation that people have talked about in Arizona is passing something that would just automatically get independents engaged in the primary by giving them a ballot without them having to request one. So I think that might be legislation.
I think it's important to differentiate between government obligating you to go vote and government simply making it easier for you to go vote. Like I'm one of the few rare birds that will argue against mandatory voting. I don't think that's wise. By the same token, you've got the problem with the independents. If they get one card in the mail ever, period, that explains to them, you as an independent in the state of Arizona may request a partisan ballot, that's it, done. And you'll never get that card again. You get in Maricopa County a card in the mail that confirms that you are on the permanent early voter list, which I personally think is the most confusing piece of elections mail on the planet. It makes it look like you have to do something to get your vote by mail, and if you do anything with that card other than pitch it in the trash, you kick yourself off the vote by mail. I also think Drew Pauly is 1,000% correct on same-day voter registration. Arizona has very stringent voter ID laws. You have an ID that has a barcode that you can swipe to buy a beer, you can swipe to get checked onto a plane. Why can't you swipe it to get the right ballot? I mean, right now in Arizona's second, we're still fighting over which votes are valid and which votes aren't, and we're still waiting on a congressional seat to be decided because you have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of ballots that are in question because they're provisional, because people went to the church instead of the library or the library instead of the church, and it's the same positions that are on the same ballots. I think when you start getting into sort of those level of weeds, we can start finding, okay, what are the technical pieces of this process that are maybe hard for the voter to understand, that maybe if we could just get the gears to turn a little bit slicker, people would have more faith in the system, be more likely to turn out, would be less of a running joke of, gee, how long is it going to take to count the ballots this year?
Maybe I'll start because I'm in part responsible for the current state of clean elections. When clean elections was
Actually, would you do me a favor and just
Sure.
explain to everybody what clean elections are for those who don't know? Quick explanation.
Yeah, you picked the wrong person for that. Clean elections was a ballot measure passed by Arizona voters in 1998 to create. This is where I will get myself into trouble. To create various and sundry things in Arizona's election law, part of which is why.
Level playing field was I think, what the voters, what the description of the initiative
It was publicly funded elections, it pushed as a level playing field, and there's a couple of other pieces to it. One of the major pieces of clean elections originally, and we can have a long debate over what the purpose of this provision was. It was called the matching funds provision. And in Arizona, the matching funds provision said that if you were a participating candidate in clean elections, and you were opposed by a person who was not participating in clean elections, you got, as a participating candidate, a base level of funding, a certain amount to run your campaign with. And if your opponent raised more than that amount, for every dollar that the opponent raised that was more than that amount, you got 94 cents on the dollar. And if anyone ran an independent ad in favor of that person or against you, you got matched 94 cents on whatever that was as well. The reason that was put in was ostensibly to keep a level playing field amongst participating and non-participating candidates. If you, as we did, look behind some of that rhetoric, you see that maybe the larger goal was to wind up limiting the amount of money that was spent in elections, which means that there's less speech happening in elections.
It was also, sorry, Paul,
Yeah.
also to try to bring in candidates who would otherwise not feel like they could run for office because they didn't have traditional funding sources. They could be funded through the, through the public system to run for office. So it was supposed to recruit people as candidates.
3 years ago, time flies when you're having fun. 3 years ago, the United States Supreme Court, in a case that I was litigating with some other of my colleagues at the Institute for Justice, declared that provision unconstitutional because it was an unconstitutional burden on free speech. So that's sort of whatever you think of that ruling, that is where we're at today. If any of you have a problem with it, I'm happy to debate it later on. It's probably not the place to do it right now. But that's where we're at today. So today, clean elections candidates still receive the base level of funding, but they cannot receive matching funds. The thought was initially that this would kill clean elections as a viable funding source for serious candidates, because serious candidates would not want to risk being massively outspent, because if you take clean elections money, you can't raise anything else yourself. And so there was initially some run away from clean elections, though I would note, and I was really hoping Tom would be here so I could needle him with it, clean elections had a really fantastic success this term. There's a candidate who won political office, who was a political novice, who had a message that resonated with voters, but had absolutely no big money buy-in. She was ultimately outspent in her election 7-1, and yet she still won. Let's all give it up for Superintendent of Public Instruction, Diane Douglas. So, snarkiness aside, I think this shows that clean elections candidates can still win in Arizona.
I would argue that it had nothing to do with clean elections.
Well, and I would argue that the windfall argument in Effective Senate is obviously disproven in 2012 and 2014. Like, I'm not one of those people that's so partisan that would argue that there was any partisan argument made in that case. But that windfall argument made the assumption that if let's say I was a billionaire, which I'm not, I would limit the amount that I spent to stop my opponent from getting some windfall from the state government. Take Terry Goddard. Terry Goddard has been running clean in Arizona for ever, God bless the man. Up until 2012, every time that Terry Goddard ran, Terry either this much outspends his Republican opponent, or they match him and the elections go how it goes. He's been elected to Attorney General, he's never been elected to governor no matter how many times he's tried. This past cycle, Terry Goddard running up against Michelle Reagan doesn't have the matching funds. You would think that if there was any fear by Michelle Reagan of some windfall, now that that's gone, that she would outspend him, that she would use the same money-raising apparatus that she used to be Cardin in her primary to crush poor Terry Goddard, and she doesn't do it. Without those matching funds is the first time that Terry Goddard, as a clean elections candidate, outspends the Republican on the other side of that ballot. So in terms of what's the impact of matching funds, I mean, I think, yes, it does absolutely have an effect there of leveling the playing field. And I think, I'm sitting in a room full of lawyers, and I am not one of them, I would think that there should be some avenue to readdress that windfall argument now that we can sort of see what happens when you actually don't have that match, and what is actually the impact of, does the strategy change on the part of the wealthier, well-funded candidate or not? I think, looking at Terry Goddard's race, you sort of have, races, plural, excuse me, you can sort of see the trajectory of clean elections of when he's running clean for Attorney General and he's got the matching funds and he's able to go out there and make the case. The voters are smart enough to say, yeah, I want that guy as Attorney General. I don't want him so much for governor. You take that matching fund away and all of a sudden here's Terry Goddard running clean, speaking out against dark money, and he's drowned in dark money with not really a whole lot that he can do about it.
You know, the interesting thing about this debate is that we have, because this is a citizens initiative, it had to be puzzled together with the current statutes that also existed that had been passed by the legislature. So there's a tremendous amount of confusion, an awful lot of homework that has to be done by a candidate. If you were to run for office as an average citizen of the state of Arizona, trying to figure out what you can and cannot do is nearly impossible. Even though there's a huge handbook that the Secretary of State's office gives you, there's opportunities all the time to accidentally back into a mistake that could have a huge penalty, both legally and politically for it. And so I think all of us are probably committed to creating a system, whether it has public financing or not, that is a little more simple for the candidate to be able to maneuver, so that they don't have to have a law degree, be a lawyer, or have an elections background in order to stay out of trouble when they're trying to advocate be elected on.
You've actually segued into what I want to talk to in question 5,
Yeah.
and it sounds like actually there may be a bit of consensus on the panel, frighteningly enough, about what do we think of Arizona's election laws and what's something that we can be doing about them or to improve. You probably stole my thunder earlier when she said that Title 16 needs to be totally reworked because of the way it's been amended piecemeal over the years. I focus, as I said, entirely on campaign finance law, and I can tell you that the portions of Title 16 that dictate campaign finance law in Arizona are a disaster. There are parts in those statutes that date literally to statehood, where that language has stuck around since statehood, but other pieces of language around them have been inserted and deleted and moved around, and it gets to the point where not even campaign finance lawyers oftentimes can tell their clients, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. And imagine if you aren't a person who can afford a campaign finance lawyer. I mean, I work for cheap, I work for free for my clients, but I don't advise them on what they can do, don't do. And campaign finance lawyers aren't cheap because of the high level of knowledge that they have to bring to their craft. I mean, it all needs to be sort of disassembled, taken apart, and built back up from a foundation. And we may disagree on what those foundations are, the particulars of the statutes that should exist, what are the particular laws, but they're a mess.
And if you layer on top of the statutes, the case law, I mean, you can't ignore the fact that we've had various courts around Arizona interpreting these provisions and talking about, what a particular statute means, how it's properly enforced, when somebody's violated it. It's very confusing. It's not just confusing for the candidates, but, from the perspective of an election lawyer, when I'm counseling my clients, I would say, 6 out of 10 times, we are taking a gamble when we're advising our clients. We're saying this is kind of a novel issue. Let's test it. Let's see what happens because it's not clear. And that's not really a good approach to practicing.
And it's usually the moment that somebody in my position, when you're asking questions and running campaigns, and your lawyer tells you that, and okay, what do I tell my donors? What do I tell my candidate? What do I tell my supporters? What do I tell voters? What the hell do I do if the court decides that my lawyer is wrong? I mean, Mr. Avalar is correct. It's a giant mess. We should absolutely take a long, hard look at elections law in this country, especially the amount of it that changes every year and every cycle. This year, there were changes made around disposable phones that we've always used, these disposable prepaid cricket phones to make calls, that sort of thing in campaigns. Couldn't do it this cycle. Then the lawyers said, well, we're not sure if that applies that way. And there was so much back and forth that we never really did get a decision from our lawyers as to whether or not we could use those phones. And they're still sitting in a box somewhere. That sort of stuff causes resources that could be going into voter contact to not.
And part of the problem, and maybe John can actually speak to this, we've had folks at the legislature who've tried to undertake sort of a revamping of parts of the statutes. Last year, Michelle Reagan, as the head of the election law or election committee, I don't even know what it's called at the legislature, introduced, and then the legislature passed the omnibus election bill, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, HB 2305, which was then subject to a referendum and then repealed. So basically, none of those statutes went into effect, but there was sort of an attempt to do it. And a lot of my clients would have said, look, we didn't have a seat at that table. We didn't really get to put in our input. These laws were passed. They were really partisan in nature. It really didn't. So we need to be doing it. Some people are trying to do it, but I'm not sure it's being done effectively or really done with sort of all the necessary people who should have input in the process, participating.
Well, and if we believe that, as the Supreme Court does, that giving money to a candidate is part of your protected political speech, then it would seem to me that with technology we can do immediate reporting of people who give money to candidates, along with, if you take the limits off, or even if you have limits, like right now the limits for the legislature are $2,000 per contribution. For city offices, it's $2,500 per election. And so, if there is instead of all of the regulation that goes around this, to create just a cycle of transparency where everything is immediately reported, so the public can decide if it's a good thing or a bad thing, who's getting money and who they're getting it from. But I think that the more we try to regulate it, the more we mess it up. And in a lot of ways, the regulation then makes it more difficult for people to participate and be successful in the political process.
Disclosure is a regulation too. And we have seen in recent election cycles that with all of this disclosure information now out there and readily accessible on the internet, databases, through all kinds of ordinarily wonderful things that we can do in the information age, that it has become much more powerful than it used to be. It used to be in the olden days, if you wanted to get information about who had contributed to a candidate or to a ballot measure, what you had to do is you had to go to the whatever office it was and look at literally the hard copy reports. There's something of a practical limit on the use of that information. Today, it's all digitized. And there are now companies and websites that are specializing in leveraging this information for various uses. There's a smartphone app now where you can take a picture of the barcode of like a can of corn, and you can find out based through this app, well, what's this company spending its political money on? It's the CEO has given this much to these people, and the employees have given this much to these people, and I mean, do we really? Question one, do we really want a society in which literally every consumer transaction we're entering into is politicized? It seems sort of unhealthy at a certain level. The other one is that there are threats of harassment, and there are people who don't want their information out there. The leading case on anonymity in political speech is probably NAACP v. Alabama. In which the state of Alabama back in 1965, I believe, asked the NAACP for a list of its members because the NAACP was engaging in certain political activities or corporate activities in the state of Alabama. And you know, the state of Alabama thought the people of Alabama had a right to know who these people were. We all know why Alabama really wanted that information. We know it. We're not stupid. We know exactly why they wanted it. And the Supreme Court said no. When you require people to put all of their personal information out there about their politics and their association, you will chill some number of people from getting involved in politics in the first place, and that's the opposite of what we were talking about earlier. So, although I agree that there may be some things that you can do with disclosure in some instances, let's not pretend that disclosure is a one-way ratchet and that everyone has to know everything about everyone. I mean, do you really need to know if someone gives $50 to their neighbor to run for city council? Does that really tell you anything? And if people know that giving $50 to their neighbor to run for city council is going to be put out there, they may be less willing to do it. And whatever one thinks about big money in elections, I don't think it's a problem. Other people do. I think these rules hit hardest on people who give small amounts, who aren't professional politicians, who aren't out there in the public eye already. You know.
It's interesting though, you know, the clean elections process, I think, was largely brought forth in 1998 in order to allow candidates that weren't being funded to get on the ballot and win. It was largely supported by, I think, the folks that would probably be more on the left side of the political spectrum than the right. But what the effect of clean elections has been to really polarize, especially on the Republican side, the ideological bent of many of the candidates who are elected that probably couldn't have raised the money to get into elective office. Now they can get the public financing to get there. And a lot of the polarization that you see in Arizona politics may be related to the last reform, which was clean elections. It's funny, every reform at the time seems like a great idea, and years later even PACs, right? PACs were the 1976 post-Watergate reform, and now we talk in a negative way about political action committees and how they're operated. It's funny, you never know in politics when you're shooting for a policy whether you're going to get the intended result that you want once it mixes in the political system. And I think with clean elections, we probably didn't get the result that the advocates at the time were looking for.
I think on disclosure, it is one thing to refuse to disclose the members of a private group. It is another to, I can give you $1 million to run for office as long as I do it through an independent expenditure or a 501c3 or a C4, and then I never have to be disclosed that I gave $1 million to this campaign. I think in politics you are very much asked to take a position. And you're very much asked to go put your face on that position, and go out there and advocate for that position to 50% plus one of your fellow countrymen. And I think if we're going to start talking about money as speech, and if we're going to ask all of these people to go and speak, then they ought to go and speak. And they ought to do it on the same rules that the rest of us in this field have to do it on. I think, to the lawyers in Alabama that made sure that suffrage is a thing for most of this country, they didn't get any anonymity when they signed their names to court cases, when they were assigned to those dockets. They sure didn't get any anonymity when they were harassed, when they were shot at, when they were killed. Why should somebody that's giving $1 million get any anonymity? I kind of get the point that there's a chilling effect there on giving your $25 or giving your $5 clean election contribution, but people give those $5 clean election contributions. You can find 300 people to give you $5 to run for legislature. If that person giving $5 to run for legislature has to disclose, why doesn't everybody else? If I can't run an anonymous candidate, why can I have an anonymous PAC? Why can I have an anonymous IE? Why can I have anonymous donors through C3s and C4s? That just doesn't process to me.
I think that it's important for this, on this disclosure issue, to take a step back and really talk about what the purpose is. And I think John mentioned one of them, which is transparency. People want to know sort of who's, and Paul did too, who's involved in what. I would argue that another reason that we have disclosure rules is not just for transparency for the public to see, because honestly, how many citizens go and are looking up who's donating to who very few. But it has there's a compliance issue. You know, we have laws that say you can spend money in these certain ways, and in some cases you're availing yourself of benefits. Like for example, 501c3s and c4s get benefits from the federal government in terms of tax exemption because they say they're doing certain things. So if they're then doing other things, the disclosure rules help sort of keep those entities in check. The same is true for candidates. You can't get money from corporations as a candidate, so disclosure sort of allows people to keep candidates in check. The problem with that purpose of compliance as a justification for disclosure is that there has to be enforcement. And I think, sort of my last word on the question 5 issue, I think one of the parts of the Title 16 statutes that's really problematic is the enforcement provisions. We have these statutes that say you have to do certain things, you have to disclose, you can only get money from these groups, you can only spend money in these ways, and then there's really no mandatory enforcement mechanism. You can file complaints, and I file hundreds of complaints from my clients, and I know the other side does the same, and the Secretary of State is inundated with these complaints. They sometimes investigate, they sometimes don't, and even when they investigate, they don't necessarily do anything about it. And so then you end up with this system where people are like, don't really care if they're complying because there's not any enforcement. So I think that there's also...
You file complaints on behalf of the people who are opposed to the speech of the people who you're complaining against. I'm not saying that in like a rude way. It's just like you file complaints by Democrats on behalf of Republicans and vice versa. Like, let's not pretend it's the public who's screaming about this. It's the insiders who are playing the insider game, who have the lawyers.
Guys, I know that we're getting into the meat and bones, and I'm so sorry that we're going to have to cut it short, so I'm going to take one last comment from anybody that wants to give one.
Give my time to pose.
Let's pretend that the public decides that the public would like for there to be an avenue for the public to give people speech that they can go and use, and let's imagine that the public decides that they want to institute certain safeguards about how the public's money is spent. And let's say that the public decides that if you misspend their money, the repercussion is you're thrown off the ballot or out of office. If that's not enforced and turns into a settlement of $1,000 payable in monthly installments, I think that's what Rupali is driving at in terms of the ability to enforce, to have some teeth in these laws. If they're not going to be enforced or enforceable, if you're not going to have a mechanism that can fairly look at the law so the rest of us that aren't lawyers can look at that thing and say, yes, it at least makes fair decisions, you're going to erode the confidence of the voters in that system, and they're going to stop showing up at the polls.
I'm respecting your sort of last comment thing.
I can move on to a last comment. So.
Oh, are you asking everybody for a last comment? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, misunderstood. Yeah, I feel, I don't know, can I go last?
Sure.
Okay, then I can comment on all of your comments.
There's a lot in this field, a lot more than 4 people can discuss in an hour. I mean, this is a conversation that really we've been having since 1972 and the passage of the Federal Elections Campaign Act. Say that 5 times fast. I would note that since 1972, and since the era of modern campaign finance law, we've seen the rise of a couple things that most people agree is not good, which is public trust in the government has decreased since 1972. The retention rate for incumbents has increased since 1972, and the complexity of an everyday person faces in trying to do nothing more than like a Norman Rockwell painting of free speech in America faces increased burdens. Like those are bad things, and I don't know that the demand that we can just legislate more campaign finance laws really gets to that. I'd like to return to whatever we think about election laws, like they need to be more simple and easier to understand. And we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not just lawyers and professionals who are going to have to be grappling with this. It is the public at large, and so we have to keep an eye towards that.
it's interesting, we look back on our founding fathers and we say, man, they were so civil and really are the model for how we want to operate as a country. And in the elections of, post George Washington's near unanimous election, these contests for elected office were very, very aggressive. And the dark money was alive and well in the Adams-Jefferson.
Washington famously complained that he lost an election because he didn't buy enough beer for people.
That's right.
I guess that was a problem.
Yeah, and so our country is based on mixing it up between candidates, them giving their best fight, and you making the decision with as much information as you choose to go find out about these candidates. And it relies on all of us to be participants in the process. And you can't regulate participation, and you can't make it a system good if people don't take the time themselves to become an educated voter and actually exercise their vote.
So I actually agree with all of the panelists and the things they've said. And I think, all jokes aside, I really think that developing a system where people feel engaged is really important. And I think we do that by simplifying the process. And also, I think allowing people the opportunity to be engaged by, and I know this sounds very cliche, but I think the partisanship that has overtaken our political system in the voting process has really been extremely detrimental for individual citizens and voting. And I think that to the extent that, and John was right, we make these laws because there's a particular party that's in power, but really that shifts. There's always, the pendulum swings back and forth. So really to be able to develop laws in a process that is neutral or as bipartisan as possible is really important because, you can't predict how it's going to ultimately affect the public. So it would be better for us to just sort of, I think, develop a plan that makes the most common sense. And
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it.